Steve McQueen, often dubbed the King of Cool, was an iconic figure in Hollywood during the 60s and 70s. He was renowned for his magnetic screen presence and anti-hero roles. While his performances in films like Bullitt and The Great Escape solidified his status as a cinematic legend, behind the scenes, his fiery personality and desire to dominate the screen led to some bitter rivalries with his co-stars. Join Factsverse as we present He Utterly Hated Steve McQueen, Now We Know the Reason Why. Paul Newman and McQueen. Paul Newman and Steve McQueen, two of Hollywood's most iconic actors, shared a complex relationship marked by mutual respect, professional rivalry, and a shared passion for racing. Both actors rose to prominence around the same time in the 1960s and quickly became leading men in the industry. Their similar career trajectories and on-screen personas often pitted them against each other, both in the eyes of the public and in the industry. This professional rivalry was most evident when they were considered for roles in the same films. The most famous instance was during pre-production of the classic film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Originally, McQueen was offered the role of the Sundance Kid, with Newman playing Butch Cassidy. However, disputes arose over who would get top billing, leading McQueen to drop out of the project. The role of the Sundance Kid eventually went to Robert Redford, and the film became a massive hit. When they did star together in The Towering Inferno, released in 1974, there were definitely issues. The movie was a star-studded disaster film that brought together the two icons. Given their rivalry and status in the industry, their collaboration was bound to be eventful. While the movie was a commercial success, behind the scenes, the dynamics between the two stars were intricate and at times tense. One of the most significant issues was screen time. Both actors were concerned about having equal screen time, reflecting their equal star status. The script was reportedly adjusted multiple times to ensure that both McQueen and Newman had the same number of lines. The question of who would get top billing was another point of contention. Given their previous rivalry over Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, this was a sensitive issue. The solution was innovative. In the film's promotional materials, McQueen's name appeared first, but placed slightly to the left, while Newman's name, though appearing second, was positioned slightly higher. This diagonal billing ensured that depending on how one looked at it, either actor's name could be seen as having precedence. McQueen played a fire chief, while Newman played an architect. McQueen was reportedly unhappy that his character was introduced later in the film, even though his role was crucial to the plot. To address this, a scene was added at the beginning to introduce McQueen's character earlier. Despite these clashes, both actors maintained a level of professional decorum on set. They recognized the importance of the film and the value each brought to their respective roles. In the end, it stands as a testament to the professionalism of both actors. Plus, beyond the silver screen, they both had a deep passion for racing. McQueen was an accomplished motorcycle and car racer, while Newman became deeply involved in auto racing and even competed professionally. James Garner and McQueen. James Garner and Steve McQueen, both prominent figures in Hollywood during the 60s and 70s, had a relationship marked by professional rivalry and contrasting opinions. While they shared screen space and had similarities in their on-screen personas, their off-screen dynamics were less harmonious. Both Garner and McQueen were known for their roles in action-packed films and TV shows. Garner's fame skyrocketed with the series Maverick, while McQueen had become a household name with Wanted, Dead or Alive. Their similar career trajectories and roles often led to comparisons, and they were occasionally considered for the same roles, fueling the competition. James Garner was quite vocal about his opinions on Steve McQueen. He once famously remarked that McQueen was not an actor, implying that McQueen relied heavily on his screen presence and charisma and not on genuine acting skills. Garner's comment reflected a broader sentiment in some Hollywood circles that saw McQueen as more of a movie star than a trained actor. Beyond his own views on McQueen's acting abilities, Garner also had personal reservations. He felt McQueen often copied his mannerisms and style, especially in the early stages of McQueen's career. This imitation in Garner's eyes was not flattery, but rather a sign of McQueen's lack of originality. Despite their rivalry and differences, Garner and McQueen shared screen space in the classic war film The Great Escape. While the film was a success, their interactions were reportedly distant. Yul Brynner and McQueen. Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen's rivalry is one of the most storied feuds in Hollywood history, especially during the filming of the classic western The Magnificent Seven. Both actors, with strong personalities and significant screen presence, clashed repeatedly on set, leading to a series of well-documented confrontations and power plays. Brynner, already an established star with an Academy Award under his belt for The King and I, was the lead in The Magnificent Seven. McQueen, on the other hand, was on the cusp of major stardom. Their roles in the film mirrored their off-screen dynamics, with Brynner as the leader of the group and McQueen as the right-hand man. Steve, known for his rebellious nature and desire to stand out, employed various tactics to divert attention from Brynner and draw the camera to himself. One of the most famous instances was when McQueen would toss a coin or rattle shotgun shells during Brynner's lines. These subtle actions were designed to distract the viewer and make McQueen's character more dynamic and interesting in comparison to Brynner's. Brynner was acutely aware of McQueen's attempts to upstage him and wasn't pleased. He reportedly felt that McQueen was trying to undermine him and diminish his role as the film's lead. This led to tension on set, with Brynner demanding that certain scenes be reshot and even going as far as wearing lifts in his shoes to appear taller than McQueen in shared scenes. Their rivalry continued for years after the film, with both actors often making disparaging remarks about the other in interviews. Brynner, in particular, was known to express his disdain for McQueen's behavior on set and attempts to overshadow him. In the end, the movie became a classic, with both Brynner and McQueen delivering memorable performances. Controversy over his estate. Despite Steve McQueen's untimely death in 1980, he left behind a legacy that extended beyond his iconic film roles. His name, image, and the rights associated with them became valuable commodities. The management and control over these rights posthumously led to controversies and legal battles involving his estate. Over the years, various companies sought to use McQueen's image for advertising and promotional purposes, given his enduring popularity and the cool image he projected. McQueen's estate, primarily overseen by his children and heirs, has been protective of his image and legacy. They have, on multiple occasions, taken legal action against companies and individuals they felt were exploiting McQueen's likeness without proper authorization. For instance, in the early 2010s, his estate sued Ferrari for marketing a car as the McQueen, based on the actor's known love for racing and cars. Garner described McQueen as a stubborn little cuss. Garner and McQueen shared the screen in 1963's The Great Escape. On set, they seemed to form a close, albeit unlikely friendship, but beyond surface-level pleasantries, the two stars frequently didn't see eye to eye. And that's putting it lightly. McQueen often inflamed and enraged his co-stars with his off-the-wall antics, both on and off camera. When asked to sum up his thoughts about McQueen, Garner didn't mince words. In a couple of beautifully merciless phrases, he put the man in his place. In The Great Escape, Garner played Flight Lieutenant Bob Henley opposite McQueen's Captain Virgil Hiltz. In his 2011 memoir, Garner was quoted as saying that, like Marlon Brando, McQueen could be a pain in the ass on set. He went on to say, however, that unlike Brando, Steve wasn't an actor. Rather, he referred to him as merely a movie star and a, quote, poser who cultivated the image of a macho man. If that wasn't cutting enough, Garner continued to tear McQueen to shreds by saying that even though he had a distinct persona that he'd bring to every role and that everyone seemed to love, you could always see him acting. That's the kiss of death, Garner brutally declared. It wasn't only McQueen's talent or lack thereof that was an issue for Garner. James also felt as if McQueen's behavior on set was entirely unacceptable. Throughout his career, Steve would often cause disruptions, and during the filming of The Great Escape, he almost walked off while throwing a tantrum over his role. Evidently, this volatile situation deteriorated to the point that the film's director, John Sturges, told Garner they were considering restructuring the movie so that he would end up being its main star instead. Garner, while flattered, didn't see how that was going to work, so he sat down with McQueen to try to figure out what the real problem was. Steve told James he didn't like the part because he wasn't the hero, and he found a lot of the things that the script had him doing to be corny. Sturges ended up adding in a few motorcycle stunt scenes to pacify McQueen, and even changed his character to that of a guy who goes off into the countryside to do some reconnaissance, only to unselfishly allow himself to be recaptured so he can share the intel he had gathered with others. So at the end of the day, all of McQueen's kicking and screaming paid off for him, but this still didn't sit right with Garner, and he never let him live it down. McQueen suspected Garner of having an affair with his wife. James Garner died of a heart attack caused by coronary artery disease on July 19, 2014. He was 86, and he'd been in poor health since having a stroke in 2008. 3 years before his death, Garner recounted his storied career in the memoir The Garner Files. He spoke frankly about several former co-stars and contemporaries. Amongst some of the more stunning revelations were his assertion that movie mogul Jack Warner was among the rudest men he'd ever met, and that actor Charlton Heston's acting was stiff as a board. When discussing his relationship with Steve McQueen, he likewise didn't sugarcoat his feelings. Not only did he discuss McQueen's unbecoming on-set behavior and childlike temperament, but he also recounted how at one point Steve even became convinced that he was having an affair with his first wife. In his memoir, Garner said he didn't believe that McQueen was a bad guy, but he did find him to be quite insecure. The actor further noted how Steve's wife Nellie had told him at one point that her husband was always envious of tall, dark men, and that he had been convinced she was having an affair with Garner. After detailing his conversation with Nellie, James wrote that he always thought of McQueen as a delinquent younger brother, and that inversely, Steve viewed him as an older brother. But despite that bond, McQueen received a fair bit of criticism in Garner's scathing memoir. In case it wasn't already obvious, Garner never slept with McQueen's wife. That assertion was baseless and a prime example of what Garner had to routinely put up with while maintaining his friendship with Steve McQueen. Garner dished on Charles Bronson. Another Great Escape cast member James Garner took issue with was Charles Bronson. In the Garner Files, James referred to Bronson as bitter and belligerent. While he described McQueen as one of his friends, he didn't hold the same chummy feelings for Bronson. In fact, he reserved much stronger words to describe his thoughts. Garner wrote that Bronson was infamous for using and abusing people. In addition to calling him bitter and a belligerent SOB, Garner felt like Bronson was always walking around with a chip on his shoulder. Whenever he was on set, tensions flared and nobody around him felt comfortable. In his memoir, Garner described a particularly unsettling experience that he had with Bronson at a poker game that he held at his house about a year after The Great Escape was shot. Evidently, Bronson attempted to withdraw a bet when it was already too late. Since Bronson was playing against what Garner referred to as a street kid who was working as a Hollywood extra, Garner forced Bronson to pay him what he was owed because he knew the money meant a lot to the kid. Bronson then apparently lost his cool and threw a tantrum. He and Garner butted heads, and things almost got out of hand, but fortunately it didn't come to blows. While the situation didn't lead to violence, Garner said Bronson swore to never work with him again. A few years later, however, James and his wife Lois Clark ran into Bronson and his wife at the time, Jill Ireland, at a restaurant. As if nothing had happened, the four had dinner together. But deep down inside, Garner knew Bronson still had a grudge, and he freely admitted to holding one as well. The Garner Files' other revelations. James Garner didn't hold anything back in his 2011 memoir. Not only did we learn about his true feelings on Steve McQueen and Charles Bronson, but we also received a number of other fascinating insights into his personal life and decades-spanning career. For one thing, we found out that despite his squeaky clean image, Garner had a history of drug use. James admitted in his memoir to smoking pot throughout the majority of his adult life. He also revealed that he once did lines with comedian John Belushi. Another revelation that might surprise some has to do with Garner's political leanings. In his book, he labeled himself as a bleeding heart liberal and noted that he considered Adlai Stevenson to be the most intelligent person to ever run for president, with Barack Obama coming in at a close second. As far as his film career is concerned, Garner only rated 2 of his movies as being excellent. He gave high praise to The Notebook and The Americanization of Emily. Of the latter, he expressed delight over how audiences have seemed to have warmed up to it over the years, turning the anti-war drama into a cult favorite and minor classic. 2 of his films he thought were only pretty good were Murphy's Romance and Grand Prix. But as far as the rest of his filmography, he only considered those films to be average at best and plain terrible at their worst. And let's end with how Garner got his start acting in the first place. As his story goes, while he was working at a Shell gas station, Garner met a soda jerker who told him that he had the right look to become a big Hollywood star. After serving in the army in Korea, Garner came back to the States to discover that said soda jerk was now working as a stage producer. Since they had history, the producer decided to give Garner a non-speaking role in a stage production of the Caine Mutiny court-martial. While working on that production, James learned how to act by observing Henry Fonda perform night after night. So, as unlikely as it sounds, James Garner owed his career to a random gas station clerk from his hometown. Yul Brynner started out on Broadway in The King and I. Yul Brynner was a Hollywood actor who found a niche for himself in the entertainment industry relatively easily, with his ambiguous looks that made it incredibly hard to tell where he hailed from. His mixed ethnicity made him stand out in Hollywood back in the day, and made him the perfect choice to play the exotic role of King Mongkut in The King and I. The King and I originated as a stage musical by Rodgers and Hammerstein. Early in his career, Yul played the role on Broadway before eventually being given the chance to reprise the role on the big screen. Yul Brynner received acclaim for his portrayal of King Mongkut on stage, and even wider acclaim when it came time to reprise the role on screen. He netted both a Tony Award and an Academy Award. It was only the second film he'd ever starred in. He went on to perform in several more big films over the course of his career, including The Ten Commandments and The Magnificent Seven. It's mainly Yul Brynner's time during the filming of Magnificent Seven that we'll be focusing on. As Steve McQueen put it shortly after the film's production, he was in his element during the filming, while Yul Brynner simply wasn't. Some might take Steve's remarks at face value, but there was actually a lot more to the story. It seems McQueen was intent on making Yul's life a living hell, and it eventually grew to the point where the actor couldn't take it anymore without putting up a fight. Yul Brynner hated Steve McQueen. Besides Steve and Yul, the film also featured Charles Bronson, Eli Wallach, and James Coburn. It was a remake of a Japanese samurai picture called Seven Samurai, which most film historians argue remains the better film. Still, the American update is plenty beloved in its own right. It changed the setting of the plot from Japan to the West, and thus changed the genre from samurai film to Western. It's considered to be one of the best Westerns out there. Although The Magnificent Seven is highly regarded, and a big part of the appeal remains its stunning ensemble cast, watching the movie becomes quite the different experience once you realize how much co-stars Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen couldn't stand each other. It's not clear why McQueen chose to pick a fight with Yul, though neither of the stars was free from their own personal struggles with their ego. And although it was clear that McQueen picked the fight, Yul was no innocent victim. He was always a bit of a diva even from his earliest days on Broadway. He memorably forced the theater, playing the original run of The King and I, to build new accommodations for himself and his limousine so he could drive off from the theater without having to interact with a single one of his fans. Given that The Magnificent Seven was an ensemble film, many of its characters didn't get all that much time to shine. Steve McQueen's character was originally only supposed to have a handful of lines, but Steve threw a fit and got the director to give him a good deal more. The director essentially let Steve McQueen take over the set of the film, and the star subsequently made the shoot a decidedly negative experience for many of his co-stars. He seemed to have an especially negative focus on Yul Brynner, and some have suggested the reason was because Steve felt Yul's character was given a nicer gun than him. Before we tell you more, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to Facts First if you haven't already. Steve McQueen abused his star status on set. Steve McQueen had it his way on the set of The Magnificent Seven. The actor got the director to give him more lines and also got to frame shots so he could take up more of the screen. Still, this wasn't enough. Steve also wanted to make the shoot a nightmare for those around. He especially didn't like Yul Brynner, and there are multiple accounts of Steve doing annoying things to piss Yul off during filming. He'd always start fiddling with something whenever it came time for Yul to say a line. He'd mess with his belt, flip a coin, or rattle around the shotgun shells he was holding. It got to the point where Yul hired a personal assistant to come onto the set of the film and count how many times Steve attempted to interrupt or distract him during the filming of his key scenes. It's unclear what exactly Yul did with this information, but it seems the assistant certainly had a good number of incidents to keep count of. Both men were shorter actors. Yul was 5'6" and Steve was 5'8". This essentially put them in the same height bracket, well below the average Hollywood star at the time. However, McQueen apparently considered himself to be an average-sized man and Yul Brynner to be something of a subhuman. During scenes filmed outside, Yul would always carefully construct a small mound of dirt he could stand on so he could look as tall as the actors around him. For his part, Steve McQueen would casually kick these small mounds down whenever he came across them out of spite for his fellow actor. This seems to have been the thing that bothered Yul the most. Eventually, Yul got sick of it and physically confronted Steve McQueen about kicking down his dirt mounts. Steve later claimed that Yul's actual reasons for assaulting him was because the actor was jealous that Steve knew how to ride horses and shoot guns better than he did. Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen never managed to set aside their differences, but they did manage to wrap up the filming of The Magnificent Seven, and the film was a huge hit. Both of their careers were boosted from it, though neither really needed the boost. Yul was already a huge star, which was arguably a big part of why Steve McQueen was so intimidated. While Steve was a tried and true action hero, Yul was a fancier film star who had started out on the stage to great acclaim. Interesting stories about Yul Brynner. Other interesting things about Yul Brynner include the fact that he was a trapeze artist as a child. During this time, he suffered an accident that nearly left him unable to move for the rest of his life. He was also bisexual and had numerous Hollywood affairs with both his male and female contemporaries. He even got to hook up with Judy Garland and Joan Crawford. Yul Brynner was notable for his striking bald head, which he personally shaved himself because he thought it made him stand out. Apparently, Yul refused to ever be photographed alongside another bald man, as that would have made it seem like he wasn't special enough. The actor was married 4 times over the course of his life and passed away shortly after reprising the classic The King and I role on Broadway. This was in October of 1985. Yul starred in The 10 Commandments alongside Charlton Heston and starred in Anastasia alongside Ingrid Bergman. When Yul found out he was going to appear alongside Charlton Heston, he set about working out as much as he could so he could be more buff than the legendary Tough Man. But when it came time to star alongside Ingrid Bergman, Yul knew there was going to be little he could do to trick the audience into thinking he was taller than her. He didn't even bother to stand on a stool, telling the actress he intended to show the world what a big horse she was. McQueen turned MacGraw's life and career upside down. Born to commercial artist parents in Bedford Village, New York, MacGraw grew up with a lack of self-esteem and was surrounded by drama. Her parents were constantly at odds with each other, and her father was a morbid alcoholic whose temper flared when he hit the bottle. To get away from her home life, she started modeling, landing a pretty decent gig under Diana Vreeland. A couple years later, she scored her first role in the film A Lovely Way to Die. Her next significant bit of screen time was in the hit 1969 rom-com Goodbye Columbus. While she was modeling in college, Ali met director Robert Evans, who eventually cast her in Love Story as Jenny. One day, MacGraw visited Evans' Beverly Hills home to go over the role and ended up never leaving. The two struck up a romance and got married not long after. MacGraw's career suddenly exploded. The positive critical reception her previous performances had garnered, coupled with her marriage to one of Tinseltown's most revered directors, resulted in her being one of the most sought-after actresses of her day. In 1971, McQueen came to her home to inquire if she wanted to work with him on The Getaway. But from the moment she opened the door, Ali was absolutely smitten by the handsome man standing in front of her. They shared an instant connection that led to them starting an affair. Not long after, MacGraw left Evans and moved in with McQueen. And for a spell, their life was filled with romance and happiness that they'd never known before. Before we tell you more, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to Factsverse if you haven't already. Ali describes their relationship as chemical. In 2018, the 83-year-old actress sat down with People magazine and discussed her marriage to Steve McQueen. When describing what kind of relationship they had, Ali referred to it as chemical. MacGraw said Steve could walk into a room and any man, woman, or child would go, "Whoa, what was that?" She went on to say she was no exception. While Ali found McQueen incredibly attractive most of the time, she said there was always an element of danger with him, adding there was, as she put it, a bad boy there. In 2017, MacGraw gave another interview to the UK's Times news outlet. She described how their marriage started blissful but quickly spiraled into chaos. The two lived together in a secluded Malibu home where they spent most of their time, quote, half naked on the beach while enjoying frequent barbecues and a never-ending supply of beer and cannabis. Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau were their neighbors, but they mainly mingled with the more common folk. MacGraw told the Times she's grateful they lived there before the advent of the modern smartphone and the invasion of privacy that comes with celebrities having their pictures taken when they step out of their homes. While they still had to put up with the paparazzi, they at least knew where they were going to be. McQueen's dark side reared its ugly head. While Ali had described McQueen as being a principled and original person, when they first got together, she didn't know he was battling his own inner demons related to childhood traumas. His dad had abandoned his family when he was a baby, and his mom sent him to boarding school for troubled children when he was 14. Since then, he never trusted women. MacGraw unfortunately had to learn this the hard way. Her first red flag was when he made her sign a prenup, but at the time she was too infatuated to suspect anything about him might have been worrisome. He wanted her to quit working. Another red flag was McQueen's pre-matrimonial demand that she quit working. Instead of fighting this request and sticking with her lucrative and successful acting career, she simply submitted and stayed at home to raise their 2 sons. Pretty soon, MacGraw started feeling stifled. Steve would regularly explode with anger if he saw her so much as look at another man. Not one to talk, his eyes would often wander. Not surprisingly, their relationship quickly soured, and in 1977 they separated and divorced a year later. In 1980, when McQueen died of cancer, MacGraw was understandably devastated. Their marriage might not have been the best, but she still loved him. Throughout their time together, she always feared he would someday leave her, but she never expected him to leave the world so soon. MacGraw fell into a deep, dark depression. To numb her pain, she sought solace in alcohol. She soon found herself at the Betty Ford Clinic, where she admitted to not only being an alcoholic, but also identified as male. It's unclear whether or not she still identifies as a man, as she still uses female pronouns. But the fact that she was able to come to terms with her alcoholism was an enormous step in the right direction. She underwent extensive therapy to curb her addiction, and in 1994, she left Hollywood behind to live a quiet life in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Since then, she's penned an autobiography called Moving Pictures that has earned her the title of best-selling author. MacGraw admits that for the longest time, she continued to live in the past, always pondering what might have been if things had played out differently. But now, she's more focused than she has ever been on her future. In addition to writing, MacGraw also likes to paint, garden, and occasionally go out on a date or two. She also devotes a lot of time and energy to animal welfare causes and actively practices a daily meditation and yoga routine. She's not that interested in acting anymore, but in 2016, she briefly reunited with her former Love Story co-star Ryan O'Neal for a touring production of the play Love Letters. The 2 aging stars have maintained a close relationship over the years and still enjoy each other's company immensely. Early life. Steve McQueen, born March 24, 1930 in Beech Grove, Indiana, became one of the most popular and iconic figures in Hollywood during the 60s and 70s. His early life was marked by a challenging upbringing. His childhood was difficult as his father, William Terrence McQueen, abandoned the family shortly after Stephen's birth. His mother, Julia Ann Crawford, was unable to care for him, and he was raised by his maternal grandparents in Slater, Missouri. During this time, McQueen developed a rebellious streak and frequently found himself in trouble. At age 12, he reunited with his mother, who had remarried, and they moved to LA. In his teen years, McQueen continued to face difficulties. He often clashed with his stepfather and had frequent run-ins with the law. He was eventually sent to the California Junior Boys Republic, a reform school where he began to turn his life around. It was during this time that he discovered his love for acting and participated in various school plays. After leaving the reform school, McQueen enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps in 1947. He served 3 years, including a stint in the Honor Guard for President Harry Truman's yacht. Following his discharge in 1950, he used his GI Bill benefits to study acting at Sanford Meisner's Neighborhood Playhouse in New York City. In 1952, McQueen made his Broadway debut in the play A Hatful of Rain. He had a small role as a drug addict. Though the play itself was critically acclaimed, McQueen's role didn't attract much attention. His breakthrough came in 1955 when he was discovered by a talent scout while working as a towel boy in a New York gym. The scout was impressed by his rugged looks and recommended him for a screen test with CBS. As a result, McQueen was offered a contract with the network, leading to his first TV appearances in shows like West Point and Studio One. In 1958, his career took a significant leap forward with his casting in the lead role of bounty hunter Josh Randall in the TV series Wanted, Dead or Alive. The show was an immediate success, making McQueen a household name and solidifying his position as a rising star. The show ran for 3 seasons from 1958 to 61 and showcased McQueen's intense charisma. Transition into film. McQueen began transitioning into the film industry, making his feature film debut in the low-budget horror film The Blob in 1958. Though the movie received mixed reviews, it became a cult classic and provided McQueen with his first taste of big-screen success. He then appeared in several notable films that helped cement his reputation as a talented actor. These include The Great Escape, where he starred alongside a stellar ensemble cast, and The Cincinnati Kid, where he played a talented poker player. Throughout the 60s and 70s, McQueen's career continued soaring, with iconic roles in films like Bullitt and The Thomas Crown Affair. His performances were often characterized by his naturalistic acting style, brooding intensity, and ability to portray complex characters. Despite the success he found in his career, his personal life wasn't without its challenges. He was married 3 times. In 1956, he married actress Nell Adams, with whom he had 2 children, Terry and Chad. Despite their initial happiness, their marriage was plagued by McQueen's infidelity and the strain of his rising fame. They divorced in 1972. Following his divorce from Adams, he embarked on a whirlwind romance with actress Ali MacGraw, whom he met while filming the 1972 movie The Getaway. Their relationship quickly blossomed, leading to their 1973 marriage. But their union was short-lived, divorcing in 1978. In 1980, McQueen married his 3rd wife, Barbara Minty, a model. Their relationship proved the most peaceful and stable of his marriages, lasting until his untimely death later that year. Minty remained by his side throughout his battle with cancer, providing unwavering support until the end. While McQueen's love life often made headlines, his passion extended beyond the realm of romance. He had an insatiable appetite for motorcycles and racing, which became one of his defining characteristics. McQueen owned and rode various motorcycles, including Triumphs, Harley-Davidsons, and Husqvarnas. He even competed in professional motorcycle racing events, showcasing his daredevil spirit. His love for speed was not limited to 2 wheels, as he also dabbled in car racing. He participated in several races, including the prestigious 12 Hours of Sebring and the grueling Baja 1000. Racing provided an outlet for his need for adrenaline and served as an escape from the pressures of fame. He also found solace in the outdoors. He enjoyed activities like hunting, fishing, and off-road riding. Nature provided him with a sense of freedom and tranquility. His ranch in Santa Paula, California, known as the McQueen Ranch, became a retreat where he could embrace the natural world. Health issues. While McQueen's personal life had its share of successes and joys, it was also marred by health issues. He was a heavy smoker and suffered from chronic lung problems, a consequence of his lifelong habit. In 1979, he received a devastating diagnosis of mesothelioma, a rare form of lung cancer often linked to asbestos exposure. Despite undergoing treatment, his health rapidly declined. Not only that, but his final days were marked by a controversial decision regarding his medical treatment. In early 1980, while battling terminal lung cancer, he sought alternative treatments in Mexico, including Latril, a controversial and unproven cancer therapy at the time. During one visit, he consulted with a Mexican doctor named William Donald Kelly. According to reports, Dr. Kelly advised McQueen against undergoing surgery to remove tumors from his neck and stomach. He believed surgery would weaken McQueen's immune system and potentially accelerate the spread of cancer cells. Dr. Kelly, who was known for his unconventional cancer treatments, allegedly warned McQueen about the potential risks and advised him to focus on strengthening his immune system through diet and alternative therapies. Latril, the treatment he sought in Mexico, was not approved by the U.S. FDA and was considered an ineffective and potentially dangerous cancer therapy. Despite being advised against surgery, McQueen ultimately decided to undergo the procedure in the U.S. On October 22, 1980, he underwent a surgery called a pleurectomy, which aimed to remove tumors from the lining of his right lung. The operation, performed by Dr. James K. Abrahams at a clinic in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, was considered high risk due to McQueen's weakened condition. Death and legacy. Unfortunately, the surgery did not go as planned, and complications arose. He developed a post-operative infection, and his health rapidly deteriorated. He was transferred to a hospital in the U.S., where he passed away November 7, 1980, at age 50. After his death, his legacy as the King of Cool endured. His rebellious and anti-establishment persona made him a cultural icon of the 60s and 70s. Steve's earliest years. Steve bore a striking resemblance to his biological father, but that's just about as far as their familial relations went, as the two never really got to know each other. William McQueen was a stunt pilot who participated in barnstorming acts all across the Midwest. These popular aerial acrobatic shows featured prop planes and their immensely skilled pilots pushing their equipment and know-how to the limits. Just 6 months after he met and married Julia Crawford, William ran off and abandoned his pregnant wife. After she gave birth to Terrence Stephen McQueen in 1930, Julia sent him off to go live with her family on a farm in Slater, Missouri. She felt utterly incapable of raising a small child by herself. This was a common practice in the 30s. McQueen later recounted his time there as being fairly pleasant. He lived on that farm with his grandparents and great-uncle, Claude Thompson, who treated him like a son. Julia eventually met someone new and got remarried. Steve was about 8 at the time when Julia had her parents put him on a train to Indianapolis to live with her and his new stepdad. Even though the circumstances seemed pleasant on the surface, Steve's homecoming wasn't a happy one. His mother had been absent from her son's life for so long, she seemed more like a stranger to him than family. When he left the farm in Slater behind, he left the freedom the environment offered as well. And his great-uncle Claude had grown to be one of his closest and most beloved friends. Hey, if you're enjoying this video so far, make sure you give it a like and subscribe to Facts First if you haven't already. And stick around to learn all about Steve McQueen's celebrated film career. McQueen struggled to adapt to city life. Growing up in Indianapolis was hard for Steve. His new stepdad would beat him for the slightest misdoing, and his mom did nothing to stop it from happening. Steve also struggled in school. Even though he wasn't officially diagnosed with anything until many years later, he suffered from dyslexia, which made schoolwork difficult. To make matters worse, he also had frequently reoccurring ear infections, which left him partially deaf. As a teenager, McQueen joined a street gang and started living on the street to avoid the nightly beatings of his stepfather. He turned to a life of petty crime to support himself until he was inevitably caught by the cops. Seeing Steve as essentially a lost cause, Julia once again sent him off to Slater to live with his family. His mother remarried once again and called for Steve to come live with her. This time, however, she had relocated with her new husband to Los Angeles. Sadly, Steve's new stepdad was also an abusive monster. Following the same pattern, Steve joined a street gang and started getting into trouble. No one was surprised when he found himself once again in police custody. His stepfather's beatings then got more frequent and savage, and eventually he moved back to Slater again. But this time, he didn't stick around very long. Steve's life-changing transition. At 14, McQueen ran away from home. After getting arrested again, his mother had him legally declared as, quote, incorrigible and had him signed over to the state. Being handed over to the state and placed into the California Junior Boys Republic ended up being one of the best things to happen to young Steve. It gave him an environment of structure and normalcy that was sorely lacking. Spending a couple of years with the Boys Republic gave him confidence and calmed him down a lot, although a bit of his rebellious nature remained intact. He would revisit the California Junior Boys Republic on several more occasions, donating both his time and money to the boys in need. His visits were casual. McQueen would much rather shoot a game of pool with the kids than give them some sort of long-winded lecture. Later, in Hollywood, McQueen became infamous for some unorthodox contractual demands. He would often request items like razors and denim jeans, sometimes by the truckload. It was only discovered years later that a lot of these items were being sent over to the Boys Republic. McQueen's military years. By the time he was 17, McQueen had already held a few different jobs before he decided to enlist in the Marines. He climbed the ladder somewhat quickly, going from the rank of private to private first class in a few short months. Then he incurred an infraction that bumped him back to private. This same pattern repeated itself another 7 times. His misdeeds included things like going AWOL for 41 days, to napping while on duty, to assaulting a police officer. If McQueen had tried to pull this off in today's military, he would likely have been court-martialed or dishonorably discharged. But back then, the military tried their best to retain as many active duty soldiers as possible after the great exodus of military personnel after World War II. McQueen completed his service and was honorably discharged in 1950 with the rank of corporal. From soldier to actor. McQueen began studying acting in New York at Sanford Meisner's Neighborhood Playhouse and at HB Studio, where he mentored under Uta Hagen in 1952. He earned extra money on the side competing in motorcycle races at Long Island City Raceway. He quickly became an accomplished racer and went home each weekend with $100 in winnings in his pocket. His first lead role in a film was in the low-budget sci-fi film The Blob in 1958. He followed that one up with roles in the films The St. Louis Bank Robbery and Never So Few, which both hit theaters in 1959. In 1960, McQueen portrayed the character Vin in the star-studded film The Magnificent Seven. His next 2 big hit films were 1962's Hell is for Heroes and The War Lover. McQueen gave audiences another solid performance in The Great Escape, which featured his famous leap over the barbed wire on his motorcycle while being chased by Nazis. The remainder of the 60s were eventful for Steve, and he appeared in many films like Soldier in the Rain and The Thomas Crown Affair. In 1971, he starred in the racing film Le Mans, which later became a cult classic. In the 70s, he also starred in films like The Getaway, Papillon, and The Towering Inferno. He wrapped up his film career with powerful performances in the unorthodox Western film Tom Horn and The Hunter, both in 1980. McQueen's cancer and death. Steve developed a persistent cough in 1978. The first thing he did was give up cigarettes and went on a round of antibiotics, but his condition showed no improvement. In 1979, a biopsy revealed he was suffering from pleural mesothelioma, a form of cancer caused by exposure to asbestos. In 1980, his doctors informed him his cancer had metastasized extensively. He then traveled to Mexico to receive alternative cancer treatments since he figured he had nothing to lose. In late October of 1980, McQueen traveled to Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico, to have a tumor removed from his abdomen, even though his U.S. doctors warned him he would likely not survive. On November 7, 1980, he died of heart failure at the Juarez Clinic. He was 50 years old. Terrence Stephen McQueen was born in March of 1930 in Beech Grove, Indiana. He was raised by a single mother, as his father left the family before Steve was born. Naturally, this was difficult for his mother, and she eventually became an alcoholic. As a young child, he felt he wasn't getting much love from his mom. He also struggled in school and ran around with local street gangs, getting involved in petty crime. Eventually, Steve's mother abandoned him and left him with her own parents, who took care of him for the remainder of his childhood. He grew up on a small farm in Slater, Missouri, and later recalled he had a loving upbringing from his grandparents and from his grandmother's sister's family. His life improved due to their love, and he was now a more focused young man. He eventually joined the Marines, and this instilled a sense of discipline in him and gave him a greater purpose in life. He was honorably discharged from the military when he was 20, and he always fondly remembered his time there. He recalled the military helped make him a man and helped prepare him for his future as a film star. Before we tell you more, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to Facts First if you haven't already. Steve McQueen's career. Steve McQueen began studying acting at Sanford Meisner's neighborhood playhouse. His teacher was Uta Hagen, one of the most notable theater practitioners and teachers of her time. He began his career playing small roles and bit parts on popular stage productions, both on and off Broadway. Eventually, his manager, the eminent Hilly Elkins, realized the best place for Steve to become a well-known actor was through B-movies. He was into cars and bikes and loved racing. He was handsome and had a great on-screen charisma, and so far while work was steady, he wasn't getting roles that gave him a big break. His earliest roles were bit parts in TV shows such as Studio One, The Big Story, Climax, and Trackdown. His big break came in the science fiction horror film The Blob, which was his first leading role. He followed that up with the St. Louis bank robbery and Never So Few. His next major role was in The Magnificent Seven, where he had to hold his own among many other stars. It's still remembered as one of his best roles. It was around this time that he was also starring in the TV series Wanted, Dead or Alive. This series made him a star and got him more attention and helped bring him more offers. Throughout the 1960s, he continued to land one great role after the next. His notable films were The Honeymoon Machine, Hell is for Heroes, The Great Escape, Baby the Rain Must Fall, The Cincinnati Kid, and Nevada Smith. With each role, he gained more and more fame, and he rapidly established himself as one of the best actors of his generation. In the late 60s, he gave us two of the best roles of his lifetime. The first was as Thomas Crown in The Thomas Crown Affair. He played the charming Thomas Crown who pulled off a major heist while being tracked down by a sexy investigator. This remains one of his most famous films, and endless debates continue on whether Steve McQueen was the better Thomas Crown or whether the Pierce Brosnan remake was better. His other great role of the late 60s was the film Bullet. He played the eponymous character who was a San Francisco cop looking to track down the killer who murdered his witness. This was one of the early examples of seeing a ruthless cop on screen, and Steve McQueen paved the way for several similar films in the future. The film solidified Steve as the bad boy of his generation, and it's still an iconic film today. He was on top of his game, and the 70s was a further extension of his success in the 60s. We saw him in great films such as Le Mans, The Getaway, The Towering Inferno, and An Enemy of the People. His final two films were released in 1980, Tom Horn and The Hunter. While Steve McQueen left us a significant body of work, we could have seen so much more. Sadly, 1980 was the year that Steve McQueen passed away. Even over 40 years since his passing, Steve is remembered as one of the best actors of his generation and an icon for leading men. So how did he die so young, at the age of only 50? Steve McQueen received this fatal diagnosis before his death. Steve McQueen was sadly infected with a horrific form of cancer known as mesothelioma. He was told it would make his life harder and that it could take his life sooner than expected. During his military experience, he was exposed to asbestos as a result of working at harbors and at shipyards. This later caused him serious health issues. It's this asbestos exposure that has caused many veterans to get mesothelioma. In fact, this particular form of cancer has been rather common among veterans. Steve McQueen got even more exposure to asbestos while working on his films. Many times he had to wear clothing that protected against flames, and these would garner asbestos. In 1978, 2 years before he died, Steve began having serious issues with his health. He would cough often and have difficulty breathing at times. He was told by doctors that his mesothelioma wasn't curable, but they tried to reduce its harm via chemotherapy. He also sought alternative treatment to help him treat his illness. While this helped prolong his life a little and also helped him have enough energy to work on more films, it was sadly clear that mesothelioma was taking over his life. Steve McQueen's life and legacy. Steve McQueen died November 7, 1980, in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, at age 50. His cause of death was a heart attack. No doubt the stress that led to his heart attack was due to his illness. His death naturally came as a shock to the film industry and to his fans. He kept his illness a secret for much of his later life. His career was short-lived, but he still managed to make an impact, especially throughout the 60s and 70s. Apart from his incredible acting ability, Steve McQueen often drove the motorcycles and cars for his films. He loved racing in real life and wasn't afraid to perform his own stunts. And while we've gotten used to many actors performing at least some of their stunts today, this was rather rare for Steve McQueen's time. He was also interested in flying planes. He was an energetic personality and wasn't afraid to take risks both in his professional and personal life. He was eventually inducted into the Off-Road Motorsports Hall of Fame. He had a huge collection of automobiles and motorcycles, with over 100 in his collection. He briefly dated actress Gia Scala while the two were students at Stella Adler's acting school. He later married actress Nellie Adams, with whom he had 2 children, his daughter Terry and son Chad. The two divorced in 1972. The same year, he married actress Ali MacGraw, who left her husband, producer Robert Evans, to be with McQueen. The two were married until they divorced in 1978. His final marriage was to Barbara Minty, whom he married in 1980, several months before his death. For decades on end, the late Steve McQueen has held a reputation as one of the coolest stars to grace movie screens. In fact, he was so cool during his time, he was awarded the moniker the King of Cool. The legend of the actor was likely only made all the more large by the fact of his untimely death, which happened when he was only 50. Fans were taken by surprise when Steve passed away from a heart attack. He had known for years he was on the losing end of a cancer battle, but had kept the information away from the public. By the time people found out, it was too late. By the end of 1980, Steve was gone. His last film was a vehicle called The Hunter, and it was released the same year as his death. Steve already knew he was sick during production, but he kept that fact to himself. In secret, he was undergoing experimental cancer treatments in the desperate hope he'd be able to find something that worked. These treatments included animal cells being injected into Steve via intramuscular injections, as well as coffee enemas the actor was given routinely. In the end, it wasn't specifically the cancer that got him. However, the actor likely wouldn't have passed away at age 50 if he wasn't undergoing an incredible health battle. What really did Steve in was a heart attack he suffered while undergoing surgery related to his cancer. He was having a tumor removed, and he passed away as the result of cardiac arrest he suffered during the process. With that, he was taken from the world far too early. Therapist interview. Since Steve McQueen at least knew he was closer to death, he was able to take some steps towards coming to terms with the fact that the end was approaching. One of these ways was by sitting down for some recorded conversations with a therapist named Brew Joy. Posthumously, these conversations helped fans get a much deeper understanding of what made Steve tick. The recording was used prominently in a 2015 documentary about the actor called Steve McQueen, The Man and Lamont. One of the most shocking things from the interview was just how insecure the actor was, even right up until the end. After having accomplished what Steve did during his lifetime, one might think the fame and celebrity alone would have vanquished even the strongest of insecurities. However, the insecurities that plagued him were fundamental ones he could never shake, and they were instilled in him during his childhood. According to McQueen, he never received the love and attention needed from his parents. Because of this, he was always lashing out and doing things for attention at every opportunity. He was born in Indiana, and his father abandoned his mother when he was still young. His mother was said to have been an underage prostitute, and it was also alleged that she suffered from unchecked alcoholism. Unable to take care of her son, she ended up passing Steve on to one of his uncles. This uncle lived on a Missouri farm, and Steve didn't feel that he fit in there. By the age of 14, he had run away from the farm and was living on the streets of Los Angeles. Homeless teenage years. As a homeless teen in LA, Steve took up with a street gang. It was here that the angry youth finally got a chance to show the world he wasn't to be trifled with. Sadly, expressing his machismo in the street gang didn't do much to ward off the trauma of having been abandoned as a child. In fact, nothing ever would. Still, the time Steve spent on the streets in LA undoubtedly contributed to his hardened visage and attitude. If it wasn't for his hardened upbringing, we would never have gotten the beloved screen actor he went on to be. Even so, Steve may have considered a trade if given the opportunity. After years on the streets, Steve McQueen made the choice to step away from that gang and become a part of the U.S. Marines. He joined in 1947 and served for a few years before being honorably discharged in 1950. His time in service also undeniably contributed to the way Steve presented himself later on screen. After returning to normal life, Steve was temporarily unsure of what to do with himself. He went through various menial jobs, yet couldn't decide on what field he wanted to try. Eventually, he got the idea he might want to try acting. He wasn't so much interested in the craft as he was in the bounty of beautiful women that could be found in the entertainment industry. In addition to always being insecure, Steve was also a womanizer. Perhaps these two things went hand in hand for the beloved star. Acting years. Even though Steve McQueen didn't have a whole lot of passion for acting, he proved pretty good at it. His unique and troubled upbringing gave him a special screen presence, and audiences could tell he was the real deal just by looking at him. The actor wasn't just tough, but he had an effortless charisma about him that couldn't be learned. Not to mention the fact that he was traditionally attractive in a way other tough guys were not. Steve loved women, and some may be surprised to learn he was married 3 times over the course of his life. His first wife was a non-famous figure who garnered the actor 3 children. They divorced towards the end of the 60s because he was having a hard time staying faithful. After divorcing his first wife, he moved on to second wife, Ali MacGraw. This was more akin to a torrid love affair. Steve and Ali may have had great chemistry in bed, but had a hard time getting along elsewhere. His third and final wife was just his style, a much younger woman who waited on him hand and foot. Steve was a traditionalist who preferred his women subservient. His first wife had been subservient enough, but he had been too much of a womanizer. Ali MacGraw, on the other hand, never had any intention of being subservient to Steve whatsoever. Steve's third and final wife was named Barbara Minty. She was nearly 3 decades his senior, and the actor didn't have much energy to cheat at that point in his life. Final years. As early as during his marriage to Ali MacGraw, Steve McQueen began flirting with leaving the entertainment industry behind. Sadly, he never got to make good on that promise before his untimely death. He and Ali had moved from Hollywood to Malibu to try to give themselves a modicum of space from the industry, but they ended up not taking this break very seriously. With Barbara Minty, Steve had finally found the perfect person to escape from Hollywood and settle down with. Sadly, the two were only married for a couple of months before Steve's death. The actor had been envisioning a future where he could step away from it all and watch the children he had with his first wife grow up in peace alongside his third wife. However, fate had other things in mind for the star. Steve McQueen spent his whole life trying to prove how much of a man he was because his parents didn't love him. He fell ill in 1978. McQueen took a brief sabbatical from filming after the movie The Towering Inferno was released. He returned to film in 1978, when he worked as both an actor and executive producer of the film An Enemy of the People. Around the same time, however, he became aware of a persistent cough. At first, McQueen thought nothing of it. Over time, it grew more troublesome, and he became worried. He quit smoking cigarettes and even began an antibiotic treatment. Nothing changed, and he grew more concerned about his condition. His worsening condition didn't stop him from acting, and he appeared in the 1979 film The Hunter, even as the cough grew more pronounced. He developed a shortness of breath as well. Finally, Steve McQueen underwent a biopsy, which revealed he suffered from pleural mesothelioma, a kind of cancer that is usually attributed to exposure to asbestos. How he failed to save his own life. Steve McQueen did his best to hide his condition from the press. In 1980, experts discovered that the cancer had metastasized in numerous locations throughout his body. Despite trying to keep the illness under wraps, the National Enquirer somehow got a hold of the story, and on March 11, 1980, they announced Steve McQueen was suffering from terminal cancer. Fearing for his life, Steve McQueen sought out controversial treatments. His doctors in the U.S. announced there was nothing more they could do to treat him, so he traveled to Mexico, hoping for something that could save him. He received treatment from an orthodontist named William Donald Kelly, whose medical license had been revoked. He claimed to have developed a cancer treatment that would work, but there was no medical evidence to back it up. Steve paid Kelly about $40,000 in cash every month, but to no avail. Huge tumors developed in his abdomen. U.S. doctors warned these tumors were inoperable, and surgery would likely result in death, but Steve wouldn't listen. He underwent surgery in Mexico, and a tumor weighing 5 pounds was removed from his body. Sadly, just 12 hours after the surgery, on November 7, 1980, he died of heart failure. An extremely troubled childhood. Sadly, the end of Steve McQueen's life was just as tragic as its beginning. His father left the family before he was even born. His mother, Julia Ann, was an alcoholic who couldn't cope with the stress of having a child. She surrendered him to her parents, who raised him on a farm for the first 8 years of his life. McQueen remembered his childhood with fondness, but when he turned 9, his mother took him back to live with her new husband. Steve's stepfather was extremely abusive, and young Steve left home and began living on the streets. He joined a number of gangs and began engaging in petty crimes like theft and vandalism. His mother sent him to live with his grandparents again until he was 12. When Steve came back to live with his mother once more, his new stepfather was equally abusive, and he returned once again to living on the streets. Fed up with her son's behavior, Steve McQueen's mother took drastic measures. His mother sent him to reform school. When he was 14, Steve's mother sent him to a reform school called California Junior Boys Republic. Steve spoke candidly of his experiences there, explaining that, while it was difficult, he learned a lot from the experience. While he got into plenty of fights with the other boys, he began to mature over time. When he was 16, he was allowed to leave the school, but he retained a relationship with the institution for many years to come. As a movie star, he continued to send donations to the school as a form of repayment and gratitude. Thankfully, many years after his time in reform school, McQueen's life would be much better. In fact, he was so famous that he even had to turn down a huge number of amazing opportunities. Make sure you stick around to the very end of the video, where we'll reveal some of the roles Steve McQueen turned down. And if you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to like it and subscribe to our channel for more. He joined the military before becoming an actor. After attending reform school, Steve McQueen enlisted in the Marines. While he had learned a lot from his troubled childhood, he often fell victim to his rebellious nature and was demoted to private 7 times throughout his military career. Despite this rocky start, he eventually embraced the lifestyle of the Marines. He became highly respected after saving the lives of 5 fellow Marines when a tank broke through the ice in the Arctic and fell into the sea. He served from 1947 to 1950. After that, he studied acting in New York. His coolness sometimes drew too much attention. Steve McQueen acted alongside Yul Brynner in the 1960 film The Magnificent Seven. Yul Brynner played the lead role and put in a personal request for McQueen to be cast. Eventually, however, Brynner would regret that choice. Steve McQueen's natural flair and bravado drew the attention of every audience member, and Yul Brynner felt upstaged during most of the film. He even became worried that Steve McQueen would appear taller than him, even though Brynner was already taller than his fellow actor. He had a need for speed. It's no secret Steve McQueen had a love for any kind of vehicle. He rode cars, motorcycles, and even planes. The passion started as a boy when his great-uncle Claude gave him a shiny red bicycle. From there on out, McQueen was captivated. He developed quite the collection of automobiles in his lifetime, including 3 Ferraris and 4 Porsches. Many of his classic cars were purchased from films he appeared in. Sadly, he was never able to obtain the Ford Mustang GT390 that he drove in the movie Bullitt. He turned down a lot of roles. Being a certified movie star isn't always easy. Unfortunately, Steve McQueen had to make a lot of tough decisions throughout his career, which sometimes involved turning down roles. He was offered a role in the classic film Breakfast at Tiffany's, but he had to turn it down due to a previous contract. Throughout his career, he also turned down roles in Ocean's 11, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and Apocalypse Now. Steve McQueen's death was especially tragic because there was so much left for him to accomplish. Were you more surprised he was sent to reform school as a child, or by all the amazing roles he had to turn down? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to FactsVerse for more.